The rain came down in cold, relentless sheets across the French countryside in the autumn of 1944, somewhere between the battered remnants of a Norman village and the advancing American lines. A young German soldier named Klaus Müller lay in a muddy crater, his legs shattered by shrapnel, his uniform soaked through with rainwater and blood. He was 19 years old, terrified, and certain he was going to die from his wounds. But from what he had been told would happen if he fell into the hands of American troops, particularly the black ones. For months, Nazi propaganda had filled his head with grotesque lies. His officers had warned him repeatedly, if captured by African American soldiers, he would face torture, mutilation, perhaps even summary execution. These men, he had been told, were savages, subhuman creatures incapable of mercy or civilization. As Klaus heard the rumble of American vehicles approaching and saw the first helmeted figures emerge through the rain, his heart seized with terror. Through his blurred vision, he could make out their faces. They were black soldiers. What happened next would shatter everything Klaus Müller thought he knew about the world. The lead soldier, a staff sergeant from Georgia named Robert Hayes, approached the crater with his rifle at the ready. He looked down at the wounded German, saw the fear etched across the boy's face, and saw something else too. The same terror he had seen in the eyes of wounded men on both sides of this terrible war. Without hesitation, Hayes slung his rifle over his shoulder and dropped into the crater. While Klaus flinched and tried to crawl away despite his useless leg, Hayes began speaking in a calm, steady voice. He didn't speak German, and Klaus barely understood English, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone trying to help. Hayes called for his medic, a corporal named James Washington from Detroit, who slid into the crater with his aid kit already open. Together they worked on Klaus's leg, applying a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, giving him water from Hayes's own canteen, even sharing a cigarette to calm his nerves. Klaus kept waiting for the violence he had been promised, for the savage treatment his propaganda had predicted. Instead, he received care that exceeded what he had often witnessed from his own Wehrmacht medical staff in the field. As Washington bandaged his wounds with surprising gentleness, Klaus began to weep not from pain, but from the crushing realization that everything he had been taught was a lie. This scene, or variations of it, played out thousands of times across the European theater of World War II, creating one of the most profound and overlooked ironies of the entire conflict. German prisoners of war indoctrinated to fear and hate black soldiers consistently found themselves treated with greater dignity, compassion, and humanity by African American troops than they had experienced within their own military hierarchy. Meanwhile, these same black soldiers who extended such grace to enemy combatants faced systematic discrimination, segregation, and dehumanization from their own United States Army. The segregated American military of World War II was an institution built on contradiction and cruelty toward its own men, despite serving their country. Despite volunteering to fight and die for American ideals of freedom and democracy, black soldiers were treated as second-class citizens in uniform. They were organized into separate units, denied entry to most combat roles, initially relegated to service and labor battalions, housed in inferior facilities, and subjected to the same Jim Crow laws that oppressed them at home. The military hierarchy believed deeply, despite all evidence to the contrary, that black men lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline necessary for combat operations. This belief persisted even as black soldiers repeatedly proved it false on battlefields from North Africa to the Pacific. The 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 black infantry divisions to see combat in Europe, fought through the mountains of Italy against fierce German resistance. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, fought for 183 consecutive days, participating in the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of concentration camps. The Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber they escorted to enemy fighters, an unmatched record. Yet, despite these achievements, black soldiers returned to bases where they couldn't eat in the same mess halls as white soldiers, where they were assigned to the worst barracks, where military police harassed them while often ignoring crimes committed by white soldiers. In many cases, German POWs held in camps in the American South received better treatment than black American soldiers stationed at those same bases. There were documented instances of German prisoners being allowed to eat in restaurants that refused service to black American soldiers in uniform. On military bases in the South, German posts could use facilities that were marked whites only, while black Gs were forced to use separate, inferior accommodations. The absurdity reached its peak when German prisoners traveled on trains and were seated in regular passenger cars, while black soldiers, the very men guarding them, had to ride in segregated Jim Crow cars. The prisoners themselves often noted this bizarre hierarchy with confusion and sometimes shame. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham wrote a famous letter to Yank magazine in 1944 describing an incident at a Texas railroad station. He and 8 other black soldiers were escorting German prisoners when they stopped for lunch. The German POWs were allowed to eat inside the restaurant while the black soldiers had to go around to the back to receive food through the kitchen door. Trimmingham wrote, "What are we fighting for? The whole heart of the war revolves around the question of whether the Herrenvolk are superior to us colored folk. Yet we are treated worse than the enemy." Yet despite facing this constant degradation, African-American soldiers demonstrated remarkable professionalism, discipline, and humanity when dealing with captured German troops. This wasn't merely following orders or adhering to the Geneva Convention, though they did that meticulously. This was something deeper, a conscious choice to treat enemy soldiers with the dignity they themselves were denied, to prove through their actions what their words could never convince some to believe, that they were men of honor, courage, and compassion. The treatment of prisoners of war was governed by the Geneva Convention, which the United States had signed and generally followed with regard to German and Italian POWs. The convention required that prisoners be treated humanely, provided with adequate food and medical care, protected from violence and intimidation, and housed in conditions comparable to those of the capturing army's own troops. American forces, by and large, followed these guidelines, but African-American units often went beyond the minimum requirements, even when doing so meant sharing their own meager rations or sacrificing their own comfort. One documented account from the winter of 1944 involves members of the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the first African-American armored units to see combat in Europe. After a fierce engagement near the German border, the battalion had captured approximately 30 Wehrmacht soldiers, several of them wounded. The battalion's medical staff, already stretched thin treating their own casualties, nevertheless prioritized the treatment of seriously wounded German prisoners. Private First Class Samuel Jenkins, a medic from Alabama, worked through the night treating a German officer who had sustained severe abdominal wounds. Jenkins used precious plasma and sulfa drugs, resources that were in short supply, to stabilize the officer. When questioned later about why he had expended such valuable medical supplies on an enemy soldier, Jenkins replied simply, "He was a human being who needed help. That's what I signed up to do." The German officer survived and later wrote about his experience in a letter that was intercepted by Allied intelligence. In it, he expressed profound shock at the level of care he received, noting that he had been treated better by these black American medics than he had been by his own unit's medical staff following a previous injury. He wrote that the experience had forced him to confront the lies he had been taught about racial superiority and inferiority. The letter concluded with a remarkable admission that if racial categories meant anything at all, then surely these men who had saved his life while he was their enemy demonstrated a form of superiority that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with character. This pattern repeated itself across the European theater. Black soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, fighting in the brutal Italian campaign, regularly shared their rations with hungry German prisoners during long marches to POW collection points. The winter of 1944-45 in northern Italy was particularly harsh, with snow and freezing temperatures making every movement an ordeal. German prisoners, often poorly equipped after the collapse of their supply lines, suffered terribly. Black American soldiers themselves, inadequately supplied due to the low priority given to black units, nevertheless shared what little they had. Technical Sergeant David Williams remembered giving his own wool socks to a German prisoner whose feet were purple with cold. "My mama raised me to help people who need help," Williams later said. Didn't matter what uniform they wore. The Red Ball Express, the famous logistics operation that kept Allied armies supplied during the race across France, was staffed primarily by black truck drivers and support personnel. These men worked grueling hours driving through dangerous territory, often under fire to deliver ammunition, fuel, and supplies to frontline units. They were the backbone of the Allied advance, yet they received little recognition and faced constant discrimination. When German prisoners were assigned to work details helping to load and unload supplies, black soldiers supervised them with firm fairness. They maintained discipline, but also ensured the prisoners received adequate food and rest, treated them as human beings rather than beasts of burden. Lieutenant Charles Thomas, who would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for heroism in combat, supervised a prisoner work detail in France in late 1944. He noticed that several of the German POWs were suffering from dysentery, but were afraid to report it for fear of being left behind or punished. Thomas arranged for them to receive medical treatment, adjusted the work schedule to accommodate their condition, and ensured they had access to clean water and proper sanitation. One of the German prisoners, a former schoolteacher named Otto Becker, later wrote in his diary that Lieutenant Thomas showed him more consideration than any officer. I served under in 4 years of Wehrmacht service. Perhaps one of the most striking accounts comes from a German prisoner named Friedrich Weber, captured during the Battle of the Bulge in late December 1944. Weber was part of a Waffen-SS unit, thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi ideology and particularly virulent racial theories. When he and several comrades were captured by elements of an African-American artillery battalion, they expected the worst. The SS had committed atrocities throughout the war, and SS soldiers knew they might face summary execution if captured, particularly by troops who had liberated concentration camps or witnessed SS crimes. Instead, they were given hot coffee, the first hot drink they'd had in days, fed from the battalion's own mess, and their wounds were treated with care and efficiency. Weber later recounted in a post-war interview that the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Here were men he had been taught to view as Untermensch, subhuman, treating him with greater consideration than his own SS officers ever had. Weber described how one of his captors, a sergeant whose name he never learned, noticed that Weber's boots were falling apart and his feet were showing signs of frostbite. The sergeant found a pair of captured German boots in better condition and gave them to Weber along with dry socks from the battalion's supply. This simple act of practical compassion, Weber said, haunted him for years afterward. It contradicted everything he thought he knew about the world, about race, about humanity itself. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, was particularly brutal. Fought in the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg in December 1944 and January 1945, it was the deadliest battle for American forces in the entire war. Black soldiers served in various capacities during the battle, including as combat troops, drivers, and support personnel. When the crisis was most severe, even the segregationist army leadership allowed some black soldiers to volunteer for combat duty with white units. So desperate was the need for infantry replacements. These men fought with distinction, and they also treated captured Germans with the same professionalism as white units, often with greater compassion. Staff Sergeant Edward Carter, Jr., a black soldier who volunteered for combat duty during the Bulge, single-handedly captured 2 German soldiers after being wounded 5 times in a firefight. Despite his wounds, Carter ensured his prisoners were treated properly, even sharing his water with them during the evacuation. Carter's actions earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, later upgraded to the Medal of Honor in 1997, decades after his death. But what impressed the German prisoners was not his ferocity in combat, but his humanity afterward. One of them later stated that Carter could have easily killed them, but instead protected them and saw to their welfare despite his own serious injuries. The irony of these encounters was not lost on the black soldiers themselves. They were acutely aware that they were extending humanity to men who had fought for a regime that viewed both black people and Jews as inferior races deserving of extermination, while their own country treated them as second-class citizens. Many wrote letters home commenting on this painful paradox. Corporal William Thompson of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion wrote to his wife, "We feed these German boys, give them smokes, treat them like men. They seem surprised, like they expected us to be monsters. Meanwhile, back home, I couldn't sit at a lunch counter next to them. I don't hate these German boys, they're just young men caught up in something terrible. But it makes you think about who the real enemy is." This sentiment was echoed across countless letters and diary entries. The black press, particularly newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, regularly published accounts from soldiers describing these ironic encounters. The Double Five campaign. Victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism took on additional layers of meaning as stories emerged of black soldiers exemplifying American values better than the segregated system they served. These newspapers served as vital lifelines for black soldiers, carrying news from home and publishing their letters and experiences. The contrast between the ideals America claimed to fight for and the reality black soldiers faced became an increasingly powerful argument for civil rights. The response at German posts to this treatment varied, but a consistent pattern emerged in post-war interviews and memoirs. Many expressed genuine surprise and gratitude. Some, like Weber, experienced profound ideological conversions. Others maintained their racist beliefs but made exceptions for the individual black soldiers who had treated them well, engaging in the common human tendency to separate personal positive experiences from broader prejudices. But even among those who remained racist, there was often an acknowledgement that they had been lied to about what to expect from black American troops, and that acknowledgement itself represented a crack in the ideological edifice of Nazi racial theory. One particularly well-documented case involves a German prisoner named Hans Schmidt, who was captured in North Africa by British forces and later transferred to American custody. He ended up in a POW camp in the American South, where he witnessed firsthand the treatment of black American soldiers stationed nearby. In his post-war memoir, Schmidt described his growing horror at realizing that German prisoners like himself had more freedom and better treatment than the black Americans in uniform. He recounted an incident where German POWs were taken to a movie theater in town with armed black guards, and the Germans were allowed to sit in the main section while their guards had to use the colored entrance and sit in the balcony. Schmidt wrote that several German prisoners complained about this arrangement, arguing that it was dishonorable to accept privileges denied to the men who guarded them. The American officers running the camp dismissed these complaints, explaining that this was just how things work in the South. For Schmidt and other prisoners who witnessed such scenes, it became impossible to maintain the Nazi narrative that America represented racial egalitarianism compared to Germany's honest acknowledgement of racial hierarchy. Instead, they saw that America practiced its own form of racial oppression, different in some ways from Nazi ideology, but similarly dehumanizing. This recognition didn't necessarily make them less racist, but it did make them question the propaganda they had been fed about the moral superiority of American democracy. The encounters between black American soldiers and German POWs also revealed the complex psychology of racial indoctrination and its breakdown under the pressure of reality. Nazi propaganda had prepared German soldiers to expect certain behaviors from certain racial groups, creating a rigid framework of expectations. The propaganda depicted black people as primitive, violent, intellectually inferior, and driven by base instincts. German soldiers were told that black American troops would be poorly disciplined, likely to commit atrocities, and generally incompetent as military forces. When reality contradicted these expectations, when black soldiers behaved with discipline, compassion, and professionalism, it created cognitive dissonance that some POWs could not resolve. Private Hermann Schneider, captured during the Normandy campaign, later described his intellectual journey in a series of interviews conducted by American researchers studying POW attitudes. Schneider had been a true believer in Nazi ideology, particularly its racial components. His first encounter with black American troops came when he was wounded and captured. He expected brutality but received competent medical care and basic kindness. Over the following weeks, as he recovered in a field hospital staffed partially by black orderlies and nurses, he engaged in conversations, limited by language barriers but still meaningful, that challenged his worldview. One orderly, learning that Schneider had studied music before the war, found a way to get him paper and pencil so he could compose even though he was a prisoner. This small act of recognizing his humanity and his individuality began Schneider's transformation. He started to see the black Americans around him not as members of a racial category, but as individuals with their own talents, personalities, and stories. A nurse from Philadelphia loved jazz and hummed while she worked. An orderly from Mississippi could fix anything mechanical and spent his off hours repairing medical equipment. A doctor from Chicago spoke 3 languages and had attended one of America's best medical schools. These were not the primitive beings Nazi propaganda had described. They were accomplished, cultured, intelligent people who happened to have dark skin. Schneider's transformation wasn't immediate or complete. He struggled with the contradiction between what he had been taught and what he was experiencing. He tried to find ways to explain it away. Perhaps these particular black Americans were exceptional. Perhaps American Negroes were different from Africans. Perhaps he had simply been unlucky enough to encounter the few intelligent ones. But as the weeks passed and he interacted with dozens of black soldiers and medical personnel, these rationalizations became harder to maintain. Eventually, he had to confront the fundamental truth. He had been lied to. The ideology he had believed in, had fought for, had killed for, was built on lies. But perhaps the most profound aspect of these encounters was what they revealed about the black soldiers themselves and their remarkable moral strength. They were men who had every reason to be bitter, angry, and harsh. They had grown up under Jim Crow, faced discrimination daily in the military, witnessed German POWs receiving better treatment than they did, and knew that when they returned home they would go back to a segregated society that would deny them the rights they had fought to preserve. They faced an enemy who explicitly advocated for their extermination as part of an inferior race, yet they consistently chose to treat German prisoners with dignity and compassion. This choice was not weakness or naivety. These were combat soldiers who had proven their courage under fire, who had fought and bled and watched their comrades die. They could have easily chosen cruelty. It would have been understandable, perhaps even justified in the context of total war against a genocidal regime. The Geneva Convention was often honored more in the breach than in the observance, and nobody would have investigated too closely if German prisoners in Black American custody had suffered accidents or received minimal care. Instead, they chose humanity. They chose to prove through their actions that they were better than the system that oppressed them, better than the propaganda of both sides, better than the worst instincts that war can bring out in people. There's a documented account of Sergeant John Davis of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion who, during the advance into Germany in early 1945, encountered a group of Hitler Youth soldiers, boys really, aged 14 to 16, who had been pressed into service in the desperate final months of the war. They had been abandoned by their adult officers and were terrified, having been told that American soldiers, especially black ones, would kill them on sight. Davis and his men disarmed the boys, gave them food, and arranged for them to be sent to a POW facility. Before they were taken away, Davis spoke to them through a translator, telling them that the war was over for them, that they would be safe, that they could go home eventually to help rebuild their country. One of the boys began crying and tried to thank Davis, who simply nodded and said, "Just remember this. Remember that we treated you like human beings. And when you go home, you treat other people the same way." That statement encapsulates the moral victory that Black American soldiers won in these encounters. They understood that how they treated prisoners said nothing about the prisoners and everything about themselves. They refused to allow hatred, justified as it might be, to diminish their own humanity. They refused to become the monsters that Nazi propaganda had claimed they were. In doing so, they not only followed the Geneva Convention and military regulations, they exceeded them, demonstrating a form of moral leadership that should have shamed their own country's treatment of them. The long-term impact of these encounters is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Post-war Germany included many former soldiers who had been captured and treated well by American forces, including Black American forces. Some of these men became important voices against racism in German society, citing their experiences as prisoners of war. Friedrich Weber, the former SS soldier who received boots and socks from a Black American sergeant, spent the rest of his life working against racist ideologies in Germany, always citing that moment in the Belgian snow as the beginning of his moral awakening. He became a teacher and made it his mission to educate German youth about the realities of Nazi ideology and the humanity of people whom the Nazis had demonized. Weber was not alone. Otto Becker, the schoolteacher who served under Lieutenant Charles Thomas, returned to teaching after the war with a fundamentally changed worldview. He taught his students about the experiences he had as a prisoner, about the Black American lieutenant who showed him more decency than his own officers, about the moral bankruptcy of Nazi racial theory. Hans Schmidt's memoir became an important document in post-war discussions of American racism, but it also served as a testament to the character of the Black American soldiers he encountered, men who maintained their dignity and professionalism despite the indignities heaped upon them. For Black Americans, these stories became part of the larger narrative of the Double V campaign in the civil rights struggle. The fact that Black soldiers had treated enemy prisoners better than they themselves were treated by their own country became a powerful argument for change. When Black veterans returned home and joined the growing civil rights movement, they carried with them the moral authority of men who had proven their worth, their courage, and their humanity on the world stage. They had defeated fascism abroad. Now they demanded the defeat of racism at home. The returning veterans found that their wartime experiences had changed them in fundamental ways. They had seen parts of the world where racial segregation was not the norm, had been treated with respect by French and British allies, and had proven to themselves and to any honest observer that Black soldiers were the equal of any troops in the world. Having faced down the Wehrmacht and the SS, having survived the most destructive war in human history, they were not willing to return meekly to the Jim Crow South. Organizations like the NAACP saw dramatic increases in membership as veterans joined and took leadership roles. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was built, in part, on the foundation laid by these World War II veterans who refused to accept second-class citizenship after having risked everything for their country. The stories of how Black soldiers treated German posts became powerful moral arguments in the fight for civil rights. They demonstrated that Black Americans were not only equal in courage and capability, but often superior in moral character to those who claimed racial superiority. These stories asked uncomfortable questions. If Black soldiers could extend humanity to Nazi prisoners, why couldn't white Americans extend basic civil rights to Black citizens? If a Black medic could save the life of a German soldier who had been taught to hate him, why couldn't a white restaurant owner serve a Black customer? If Black troops could guard German prisoners with professionalism and dignity while being denied basic respect themselves, what did that say about the moral bankruptcy of segregation? The historical record is clear. African American soldiers in World War II demonstrated extraordinary professionalism, compassion, and humanity in their treatment of German prisoners of war. They did this while facing systematic discrimination from their own military and country. They did this while dealing with an enemy whose ideology marked them for extermination. They did this not because it was easy or because they were rewarded for it, but because it was right, because it reflected the values they held dear, and because they understood that their actions defined who they were in ways that no propaganda or prejudice could alter. These men, these black American soldiers, represented the best of what America claimed to be, even as America failed to live up to its promises to them. They fought for democracy while denied full democratic rights. They defeated an ideology based on racial supremacy while subjected to their own country's system of racial oppression. They extended mercy and dignity to enemy soldiers while receiving neither from large segments of their own society. In doing so, they not only contributed to the military defeat of Nazi Germany, but also delivered a moral defeat to all systems of racial oppression, including the one that governed their own lives. In the end, the German posts who encountered black American troops learned a lesson that contradicted everything their Nazi masters had taught them: that human dignity transcends racial categories, that compassion is not weakness, and that true superiority lies not in the color of one's skin, but in the content of one's character and the quality of one's actions. Meanwhile, those black American soldiers added another chapter to their people's long struggle for recognition and respect, proving once again that they were not only equal to any soldiers on earth, but in many cases exemplars of what human beings should aspire to be. The rain that fell on Klaus Müller in that French crater eventually stopped, and he was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a POW camp, and eventually, after the war, back to Germany. He lived to old age and told his story many times, the story of how black American soldiers, saved his life and treated him with a kindness he had never expected and barely felt he deserved. He told his children and grandchildren that on that muddy day in 1944, wounded and afraid, he learned what it meant to be truly human. He learned it from men his Nazi officers had told him were subhuman, from men his propaganda had warned him to fear and hate. Klaus returned to a Germany in ruins, a country that had to confront the horrific reality of what it had done, the genocide it had perpetrated, the war it had started, the millions of lives it had destroyed. Like many Germans of his generation, Klaus had to live with the shame of what his country had been, what he had been part of, even if only as a teenage soldier who had little choice. But he also carried with him a memory of grace, a moment when enemy soldiers had shown him mercy when they could have shown him death, had treated him with dignity when they could have treated him with contempt. That memory, he said, was what allowed him to believe that redemption was possible, that humans could choose to be better than their worst selves, that kindness could exist even in the midst of the greatest evil humanity had ever known. In that French crater, in 1,000 similar moments across the battlefields of Europe, black American soldiers won a victory that had nothing to do with territory conquered or enemies killed. They won a victory of the human spirit over hatred, of dignity over degradation, of compassion over cruelty. They proved that the content of a person's character had nothing to do with the color of their skin and everything to do with the choices they made, especially the choices they made when no one would have blamed them for choosing otherwise. They couldn't believe it, those German prisoners, that they were being treated so well by men they had been taught to despise. But they learned, and in learning they added their voices to the centuries-long testimony that racism is a lie, that humanity is universal, and that grace, when extended even to enemies, has the power to transform not just individuals but the course of history itself.